If the resurrection of Jesus was the most important event in all of Christian history, why did Jesus choose to appear first to women? It may seem like just a small detail in the biblical narrative, something that many people read quickly and move on from. But when we look more closely at the account of the resurrection in chapter 28 of the Gospel of Matthew, we notice something surprising happening right in the first lines of this story. The first people to find the empty tomb, the first to hear that Jesus had risen, and the first to witness that extraordinary moment were not the apostles, nor religious leaders, nor influential figures of the time. They were women. Now think about that for a moment. In a society like that of the first century, where female testimony carried almost no legal weight and was often ignored in courts and public decisions, why did they become the first witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus? Was this merely a coincidence within the biblical narrative, or is there a much deeper meaning hidden in that moment? Many people have heard the story of Easter countless times. Perhaps you have also read this passage from the Bible or heard this story in a sermon. But have you ever stopped to reflect on this specific detail? Have you ever wondered why Jesus appeared to the women first after his resurrection? What you are about to discover may surprise you, because when we observe this episode carefully, we begin to realize that this choice can reveal something extraordinary about God's character and about how the kingdom of God works. So stay with me until the end, because this seemingly simple detail of the resurrection story may hide one of the deepest messages in the entire gospel. And to truly understand this, we need to go back to that silent morning before the empty tomb, where everything began to change. And as you begin to think about this detail of the resurrection story, perhaps something within you is already sparking a question or a reflection. Perhaps you've never perceived this moment in this way before. Perhaps this small part of the biblical account is already making you look at the story of Jesus with new eyes. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has resonated with you the most so far. Had you noticed that Jesus appeared to the women first after the resurrection? Or did this detail also go unnoticed by you for a long time? Your experience and perception can help others watching now to see something they may never have considered either. And if this kind of reflection on Jesus' gestures and attitudes is awakening something within you, take the opportunity to like this video. It may seem like a simple thing, but when you leave your like, YouTube understands that this content is relevant and starts showing this message to more people who are also seeking to better understand Jesus' teachings. And if you want to continue discovering these often forgotten details of the Bible, consider subscribing to the channel as well. Jesus Beyond Words. Here we delve into the gestures, silences, and attitudes of Jesus, which reveal meanings far deeper than they appear at first glance. Your participation here truly makes a difference. When you comment, like, and subscribe, you help this channel grow and allow this message to reach more people who may need exactly this kind of reflection right now. Now, going back to that quiet morning described in the Gospel, when the first light of day began to touch the garden where the tomb was, something extraordinary was about to happen, something that would forever change the way that story would be told. The air was still cold that morning. The city was still asleep, and the silence of dawn seemed to carry the weight of the events of the previous days. For many, everything had ended at the cross. Hope seemed buried along with the body of Jesus. But some people were still on the move while the rest of the world remained quiet. Among them were the women who had followed Jesus to his very end. They walked toward the tomb before sunrise. They weren't going there expecting a miracle. They weren't seeking an extraordinary revelation. In their minds, that journey had a simple and profoundly human purpose: to honor someone they loved. This detail completely changes the way we look at this scene. While many disciples were hiding, trying to understand the impact of everything that had happened, those women made a decision. Even amidst fear, sadness, and confusion, they continued to walk. Sometimes it's the same in our own journey. When everything seems uncertain, some of the most important decisions are born not from certainty, but from faithfulness. And then something happens that nobody expected. When they arrived at the place where Jesus' body had been laid, something was different. The stone was no longer in the same position. The tomb was open. What should have been just a final gesture of farewell suddenly transforms into the beginning of one of the greatest revelations in history. The tomb was empty. That simple, almost silent moment carried a gigantic impact. The resurrection didn't begin before crowds, nor in palaces, nor before religious leaders. It began there, behind the scenes of history, before people whom the world often wouldn't place at the center of major decisions. And in that unexpected moment, those women become the first witnesses of Jesus' resurrection. They are the first to hear the message that would change the course of history. When we understand what was happening in the culture of that time, this choice of Jesus reveals something even more surprising. If this reflection has already started to make sense to you, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. When we look at this scene superficially, it may seem like just a detail of the narrative. Women going to the tomb, finding the place empty, and receiving the message of resurrection. But when we understand what was happening behind the scenes of the culture of that time, everything takes on a completely different meaning. In the context of the first century, society was deeply structured by very rigid social hierarchies. Influence, authority, and even credibility were concentrated in the hands of a few. In many public settings, especially in courts and legal decisions, female testimony was simply not considered valid in the same way as that of men. In several situations, women were not recognized as formal witnesses. Now consider the impact of this reality. If someone were fabricating a story to convince as many people as possible about the resurrection, they would hardly choose women as the first witnesses to the most important event in the Christian faith. From a strategic point of view, this would not make sense within the mindset of the time. And that's precisely why this detail becomes so powerful. The resurrection narrative doesn't seem constructed to impress power structures or to please social expectations. On the contrary, it reveals something much deeper happening behind the scenes of the story. The choice of who receives the first revelation carries a hidden truth about how the kingdom of God works. While the world valued status, position, and influence, something entirely different was happening that morning. The most transformative message in history wasn't delivered first to religious leaders, scholars, or political authorities. It was entrusted to people who, within that cultural mindset, were often overlooked. This detail completely changes how we understand that moment. The resurrection doesn't begin within the centers of power. It begins in the quiet places, on the margins of history, where loyalty often goes unnoticed. And the more we look at this scenario, the more we realize that there is a pattern in Jesus' decisions. A pattern that defies human expectations and reveals a different logic behind divine choices. When we begin to observe Jesus' attitudes throughout his journey, it becomes clear that this choice was not an isolated accident. If this perspective is opening up a new understanding for you, write it in the comments. I'm on this journey too. When we begin to carefully observe how Jesus acted throughout his journey, we realize that the morning of the resurrection was not an isolated event or an unexpected coincidence. In fact, it follows a very clear pattern that appears repeatedly in Jesus' decisions and attitudes. A pattern that often goes unnoticed, but which reveals a mindset completely different from the common logic of society. Jesus often approached people who were outside the centers of power, people who lacked influence, position, or social recognition. While many leaders of the time sought visibility, status, and authority, Jesus seemed to walk in a different direction. He talked to those who were ignored, valued those who were left aside, and saw potential in people whom the system of the time considered invisible. This type of choice reveals something very profound about how the kingdom of God manifests itself. The resurrection could have begun in several ways. It could have been announced before religious leaders, before political authorities, or before large crowds. This would certainly have created an immediate impact within the power structures of that time. But that is not how it happened. The first revelation of the resurrection emerges from behind the scenes of history. It emerges before women who had remained faithful even in the most difficult moments. Women who were present when many others had disappeared. People whose faithfulness was not based on social standing, but on a sincere connection to what they believed. And this reveals an extremely powerful hidden truth. The kingdom of God doesn't necessarily begin in the places the world considers important. Often it begins in simple places, in silent decisions, in attitudes that go unnoticed by most people. That's how many profound transformations begin. Behind the scenes, in daily faithfulness, in choices that seem small, but carry a much greater impact than we imagine. When Jesus first appears to the women, he is not merely revealing that he has conquered death. He is showing, through a silent gesture, how the logic of the kingdom he came to announce works. A logic where humility, faithfulness, and a sincere heart carry far more weight than status or public recognition. because there is an even broader spiritual meaning hidden behind this seemingly simple choice. And if this reflection is sparking something within you, write it in the comments. This changed my perspective. When we look more closely at this moment, we begin to realize that it is not just a historical detail or a coincidence within the resurrection narrative. Something much deeper is happening there, something that reveals a spiritual truth that permeates the entire message of Jesus. That choice carries a meaning that goes beyond the culture of the time, beyond social structures, and even beyond the scene of the empty tomb itself. The women who went to the tomb that morning were not there for position, influence, or recognition. They were there out of loyalty. While many were gripped by fear, confusion, or the need to hide, they remained close until the end of Jesus' journey. They were present during the most difficult moments, when the cross seemed to represent the end of everything. And this reveals something essential about the character of God. There is a human tendency to believe that the greatest revelations, the greatest opportunities, or the most impactful moments are reserved for those who possess power, status, or authority. But the story of the resurrection shows a completely different logic. The first revelation of victory over death was not given to those who held important positions within society. It was entrusted to those who had remained faithful behind the scenes of the story. This truth brings about a profound transformation in how we understand our own spiritual journey. God isn't just observing outward appearances or human titles. He observes the heart, the silent decisions, the mindset that chooses to persevere even when the path seems uncertain. Often, the greatest revelations are born precisely in those quiet moments, when no one is watching. Perhaps that is why this episode continues to resonate throughout the centuries. It reminds us that faithfulness, even when it seems invisible, never goes unnoticed by God. That morning in the garden was not only the announcement of the resurrection. It was also a revelation about whom God chooses to entrust with his deepest messages. When we connect this story with how God continues to act throughout the human journey, we begin to perceive a pattern that still has an impact and brings about transformation today. If this reflection is resonating with you, write it in the comments below. I understood that truth. When we bring this story into the present, something very interesting begins to happen. That silent morning before the empty tomb ceases to be just a distant episode in biblical history and becomes a mirror for our own journey. Because the way the resurrection began reveals much more than an extraordinary event of the past. It reveals how God continues to act even today. We live in a world where we are often taught to measure value by visibility, position, or recognition. It seems that the greater the prominence, the greater the importance. But when we look at how the resurrection was announced, we perceive a completely different logic operating behind the scenes of the story. Humanity's most transformative message began with people who did not occupy the most prestigious places in society. This confronts us in a profound way, because perhaps many people listening to this story now have felt, at some point in their lives, that their actions go unnoticed. Perhaps you have experienced moments when your choices, your faith, or your dedication seems small compared to the expectations of the world around you. But the account of the resurrection shows that silent decisions often carry a much greater impact than we imagine. There is a hidden truth in this narrative that continues to resonate through time. God does not only work through the paths that the world considers grand. Many of the greatest transformations begin in simple places, in ordinary people, in attitudes that seem discreet to human eyes, but which carry enormous weight within the spiritual journey. The faithfulness of those women did not stem from a desire for recognition. It arose from an inner conviction, a mindset that chose to persevere even when everything seemed uncertain. And it was precisely in this kind of heart that the first revelation of the resurrection found space to take place. When we understand this, we begin to realize that this story isn't just about the past. It's about decisions that continue to be made every day, about invisible choices that shape paths, and about revelations that often emerge where no one is paying attention. As we begin to observe how this logic appears in other parts of Jesus' journey, we realize that there is an even more surprising pattern behind these choices. If this message resonates with you, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. And if you've made it this far in this reflection, perhaps you've already realized that this detail of the resurrection carries much more meaning than it seems at first glance. Sometimes, a small part of the biblical narrative opens doors to understanding something much greater about the heart of God. about how he works behind the scenes of history, and about how silent faithfulness can have an impact that spans generations. If this message resonated with you in any way, leave a comment below with the phrase, "This message was for me." It's always interesting to see how many people are on this same journey of discovery, reflecting on these details that often go unnoticed when we read the story quickly. And if this conversation resonated with you, feel free to like the video. This simple gesture helps the content reach other people who may also be seeking a deeper understanding of Jesus' gestures, silences, and attitudes, which carry such powerful teachings. If you enjoy this type of reflection, you can subscribe to the channel. Jesus Beyond WRDS. The idea here is precisely to continue exploring those moments in Jesus' life that reveal profound truths, often hidden in details that go unnoticed. And before you leave, there's a video here that complements this conversation very well. It delves into another surprising detail of Jesus' journey that also carries a meaning that many people have never realized. Click on it and continue with me there.